In this lecture, we're going to talk some more about the effects of speech sounds on each other and some things that happen when you start putting words together and getting longer strings of speech. All right, now when we say a word on its own, you get what is often called a citation form. And this is what I talked about and warned you about when you look at a dictionary transcription. It might not always be the same as we say it as we're speaking fluently. Some things get reduced or deleted, or sounds get somewhat merged together while we're talking, just as a natural part of trying to reduce articulatory effort. And so everything we're covering here is what happens in normal speech for typical speakers. Lots of words get weakened, and especially function words can get weakened, meaning they're reduced in the number of sounds or the sounds change slightly. So you can think of a conjunction as an example of a function word. There's lots of different ways we say and. If we're saying something like fish and chips, if we're very careful, we can say all of it. But usually it's going to be fish and chips, and we just say instead of the whole and. And so often you'll see these types of effects when something gets weakened, and particularly in those function words. So the length of the sound might be reduced, vowels might be changed or produced like a schwa, like an instead, or sounds can be elided. And that's something we're going to talk more about in a bit, but it just means the sound isn't there. All right, so if you look at some of the examples, you have them in your notes. You can look at them in more detail on your own. You can see the weak form here and the stronger form of the word over here on the right. So if we are saying that is a cat, we might say a. If we're saying it with a particularly strong form. But as we're talking and I just mentioned, oh, I have a cat, then I just said instead, a weak form. Right? And you have more examples here of all sorts of different weak versus strong forms for all of these words. And sometimes this causes confusion. We'll reduce things, or they'll be a weak form. And what's he like might sound the same if you would say what is he like versus what does he like. Just as an example, sometimes it causes confusion, but usually with context, people know what the person who's saying this means, despite the weakening and the loss of some of those sounds in the strong form. All right, then we have assimilation. And if you happen to be a Star Trek fan, you'd be familiar with assimilation via the Borg, but I'm going to not assume that. And assimilation is just when one thing becomes like another. And so when you have a sound that becomes more like its neighbor under its influence, that would be a case of assimilation. And usually it happens backwards. Right? We've got this word regressive. So there's influence from the following sound, and it goes backwards to the one in front of it. And in English, it happens to affect these alveolar sounds. This is why it's important to be able to spot alveolars. All right, so for an example, you can, let's say, have the influence of this p, a bilabial sound, on this alveolar t, where you say, instead of that pen, where I have to say it very carefully to make sure I say the T. Instead, you can say it to yourself and feel, do your lips close? Instead of having your tongue meet the alveolar ridge at this point, that pen. All right, or you can listen to this sample.
That person.
I'm going to have to crank it up for this recording. Let's try again.
That person.
All right. Did you hear any T there before person?
That person.
All right. And go through these other examples, or we'll discuss these more in class. But you can also try them out yourself and try and see how aware you can become of how you are saying these. All right, you've got lots more examples with different sounds. And with some alveolar nasal sounds that are also assimilated. And some alveolar fricative sounds as well. So instead of this shop, which I have to slow it down and say very carefully to make sure that I say an S and then a sh, most people are going to say this shop. Or
This should.
there in that recording is very exaggerated, but same thing. Right? And sometimes it can cause confusion. Some things will sound alike because of this, but usually, again, with context, speakers will not get confused, even with the sounds assimilating, and usually we're not really aware of doing this. Okay, so elision is emitting a sound, and before I said that the sound is elided, that's the sort of verb version of this term. It's probably a new one. But that just means where there's a sound that's not there anymore, that we think is there in other contexts. So sometimes we just leave sounds out just to make the articulation more efficient. Right? So for example, if you say next day, but you say it connected and without carefully trying to enunciate every single sound, usually you're going to say next day. Or I'll move on to this example. This is another one. Last chance. Usually you're not going to say last chance. That T just gets omitted. Last chance. All right, so try some of these out on your own and see how you feel that you say them. Trying to say them naturally and not artificially trying to slow it down or enunciate every sound, or ask somebody to read these who's not familiar with this and listen for how they say these different words. All right, and you'll see that some cases you don't always lose. It's often the sound t, the voiceless alveolar plosive. But some cases where there's like can't or an LT ending, some sort of like negative ending, and N and a T, those tend to keep it, because otherwise you would get something that would be unusual and noticeable. So if the meaning is important enough, it can be kept there. But if you hear next week, you know what's being said. There's no confusion that even though that next is pronounced a little different than we would say next in isolation. And sometimes we have things that, these are things that people are very aware of doing. Other examples of elision though, like saying gotta, you know, instead of saying got to go, we're just saying gotta. All right, or what do you want becomes what do you want? All right, or for many speakers of American English, it might be what you want, actually. Something that we'll get to a little bit later. All right, and there are different ways of saying I'm gonna watch the YouTube video and take note of how Kanye says it. We can talk about that in class. All right, now you can also have the creation of a new sound across a word boundary from sort of the influence of two sounds. And that's why this is different than assimilation. In assimilation, the sound that's doing the influence doesn't change, just the one does. In coalescence, you have two sounds becoming a different sound. Right, and you'll usually see it with those alveolars again, and usually because there's a ya, a voice palatal approximate following it. But you know, it can be somewhat dialect specific, and for most people, if it does happen, it's more with the S and Z sounds. All right, so here is the example I talked about. What you want? You may do this. Would you like one? You may say that instead of would you. In case you need it, instead of in case you need it. And has your letter come? Maybe not so likely for those of us. You can test these out and see if you do any of these in your speech. All right, now we have come to liaison, which is something that you may not be as familiar with. It's something that applies not to many American English dialects. Some American English dialects are what we call non-rhotic, meaning there is oftentimes where there's no R. So instead of saying car, we would say car. So park the car. Right? And you can think of British English as often having that feature. And within British English, you have that non-rhoticity, but then you also sometimes get R sounds being inserted between two words when one ends with a vowel and this next one starts with a vowel. So instead of saying better off, normally in a non-rhotic dialect like British English, it would be better. I mean, on its own, you say better and off. But in the UK, those who do this liaison and put the R in between this vowel and this would say better off again. And then it just sounds normal to us American English speakers who do have a rhotic dialect. But then sometimes when you watch or listen, rather than watch, to a British English speaker, you'll come into cross cases where you'll have a what's called intrusive R, or this liaison, and it's showing up in an area that sounds funny to us. Like if I read here, law and, which is hard for me to even say, law and order. Law and order. Okay, instead of law and order, because you have this aw and here, they've got those two vowels in a word boundary. For people who do this liaison, they'll stick an R sound there in the middle. Or you might see it within a word, not even across a word boundary. So you got draw, aw, and ing. And for some speakers, drawing becomes drawing. Right? And if this link works, you can see examples of that in a sketch comedy that's sort of making fun of that kind of speech. All right, that finishes up the lecture on words and connected speech. Try it out on your own, and there will be a warm-up exercise on Blackboard that you can do, and you can let me know what questions you have via that as well.